my primary focus for the majority of the time that I have been on staff with Whittington Church, even from the very beginning, was a youth focus. And I actually had a really good youth group experience myself at the church that I grew up at. And at that time, I had no desire or thought about going into ministry myself, but it was just very life-changing for me with some great people, a great youth pastor, and it was just really good. It was a good time in my life. And so I've always had that as a part of my foundation. And so when Candy and I began to attend Whittington Church, even before I was on staff, it just became an opportunity that presented itself for me to be involved in youth at some level. The first exposure I had was teaching a fifth and sixth grade boys Sunday school class, and did that for a period of time here at the church, and really enjoyed that. I remember we built a to-scale model of the Old Testament tabernacle, and so we really dove into that, had a good time with that. This has, again, been a long time ago. And eventually, as I did come on staff with the church, I had already by that time gotten involved as a volunteer with our youth ministries. And at that time, Mark was, we had Mark Miner, senior pastor, and then we had two associate pastors, Ron Sink and Greg Shelton. And so Mark was still the youth guy. He was doing that as the lead pastor. And so as I got more involved, and then eventually when I came on staff, it really was the first time for our church that we had hired someone designated to be a youth person. Now again, Mark had been doing that for decades already, but he was also the lead pastor for our church, and so it was kind of a cool transition at that time for the church and for me, where we could really just put a lot of emphasis on youth, and we've always had a lot of emphasis on youth here at Whittington Church. And so also at that time, within a couple of years of that, we built the new part of the building. What we now have is a sanctuary and what we call the upper room. The upper room immediately became a youth area, partially because it's upstairs. It's not as easy to get to as some of the other parts of the building. So it was the first time in our church's history where we had a designated person hired primarily just for youth, and then also a designated space. That other things happened up there as well in the upper room, but mostly what happened was youth ministry. So we decorated it, and we painted the walls, and we brought in furniture, and we built a little stage, and all those types of things. And so as I got more into the role of being a pastor at the church, and eventually, this is something I feel like was really important, and I still feel it's important, I began to develop a large volunteer team of volunteer youth leaders, so that it wasn't just the Bob Pankey show going on up there. We wanted it to be the Jesus Christ show, and we wanted there to be a team of people with different talents and abilities and giftings and relationships and all of that. And so God used, for a long time, for a lot of years, God used our youth ministry team to reach kids and expand the kingdom. And that was a really important part of how I approached youth ministry and what I think was important here at Whittington Church, and for God to raise up a bunch of different people through the years to be parts of that volunteer team was really important. Another thing concerning youth ministry, and this was already an attitude that was in place here at Whittington, primarily through Mark, but through others as well. Whittington has always been very focused on community outreach, getting outside the church walls, really trying to find people and draw in people that were unchurched, did not know Jesus, and introduce them to Jesus Christ. And that's obviously what we want to continue to do today. And so I took that very seriously in as far as youth ministry was concerned, and we just had a very community-focused youth ministry in the sense of reaching out to kids who were not a part of our church, whose families did not attend our church. They were unchurched. A lot of them were unsaved. Maybe some of them had never been involved in church before. And we tried to lower the walls, so to speak, and really draw them in. And so this would have been in the days of running a youth van, for example, and driving around picking up kids. I can't tell you how many hours and miles that I spent driving around Benton, Whittington, Ewing, places in between, picking up kids on Wednesday nights and Tuesday nights and all of that, dropping it back off again. And so because of that approach, and again, our volunteer youth team was all on board with that as well. And I'll say this too, our church was on board with that as well. And that is so important because when you have that approach with youth ministry, it's going to look a little different. And we had, again, a lot of kids in the building on a weekly basis who knew nothing about the Bible, knew nothing about Jesus, knew nothing about church, including how you're supposed to act in church and all that kind of stuff. And so we had a lot of broken stuff. We had a lot of holes in the wall. We had a lot of kids that were probably doing some things that they shouldn't have done in a church building or anywhere for that matter. Probably all of those things were happening. But it was part of the process of building relationships with them, gaining their trust, and then gently coaching them and nurturing them into relationships with Jesus Christ. And so that was very much a part of the approach of our youth ministry, and I believe it still is today. And it's a part that I really, really enjoyed. You can see firsthand a lot of transformation when the approach is that. Another, I think, an approach, I guess I'll call it, that I don't even know that I had this intentional thought about this. I was just sort of going with the flow of the Holy Spirit in all things, and that's always the right answer, right? But I did not want to come into youth ministry. At the time, I was in my 20s and had very little ministry experience. But I didn't want to come into it with this fixed idea in my head of what youth group or a youth ministry had to look like, and then try to force a round peg in a square hole, so to speak, and force everything to fit into that model or picture in my head. Instead, I really wanted to try to discern who we had as a part of the group and how best to reach them. And it makes sense for us to think that not everybody's going to be reached the same way. Kids are the same way. And so, for example, for a period of several years, we had a lot of athletes that were involved in our youth ministries, and they brought their friends who were on their teams, and so we had more athletes, and so we were a super athletic, so to speak, youth ministry. So we spent a lot of time doing, guess what? Playing sports. We did a lot of athletic things and playing a lot of games of dodgeball in the blue room and playing outside, just a ton of that kind of thing, and that just tended to continue to draw more and more of those kind of kids in, and again, all for the purpose of getting them to that place of relationship and trust so that we could present the gospel and talk about Jesus Christ. And then as time went on through the decades, some of that transitioned out, and then we had a period of time where we had some really musical kids that got involved in our youth ministry, that played guitar and drums and keyboards and those kind of things. And so we kind of went with the flow and adapted to it and became more focused on music and specifically worship. And so we built a stage in the upper room with a sound system and lights and put a soundboard up there and all those kind of things. And we had a live praise band every single week at youth ministry, at youth group, for years, a long time. And God used that time and those kids in really powerful ways and really grew, not just grew the youth group in numbers, but grew each of us, including myself, personally, spiritually, through those times. And so there was that time. And during that time, coffee shops were really starting to pop up, and hanging out in coffee shops became the cool thing to do. So we built the Crossing, which started out to be a coffee shop. And instead of playing dodgeball in the blue room, all of a sudden we had this group of kids who wanted to hang out in the Crossing and drink coffee, of all things, as a bunch of 16-year-olds, hang out, talk, visit, spend time together. Then we'd go upstairs, have worship and Bible teaching and all of that after that. And so those are just examples of being not just willing, but discerning the Holy Spirit along the way of who do we have and how can we best reach them. And if it's a little bit of a stretch for me, so be it. I'll stretch. I want to stretch so that we can reach every kid, And so that was, I feel like, an exciting part of youth ministry during my years involved. And again, we gave us an opportunity to see and know a bunch of different kids from a bunch of different backgrounds, and I believe God's still using that today. Another important focus of, I believe, any youth ministry, but certainly through the years, the youth ministry at Whittington Church has been this idea that this is true for adults as well as our kids. We don't want to just come here and receive. It's not just sit and get, but it's also that God is calling us, even teenagers, to ministry, and ministry in various different ways. And so, as a result of that thought process or that approach, that attitude, we always wanted to and still want to stretch our kids into serving in different ways, even in ways that may be a little uncomfortable for them at times. And so Mark had already started a process, for example, before I came on staff of taking groups of kids up to Chicago to an inner city church called Uptown Baptist Church that provided a weekly meal for homeless and underprivileged people in the city of Chicago. And when I came on staff as a pastor, I just took over that, and we started doing them actually 2 or 3 times a year, taking lots of kids up to Chicago 2 or 3 times a year on mini mission trips, usually just a couple days long, giving them an opportunity to feed homeless and underprivileged people, to see and experience something completely different than anything they've ever seen before. Along with that, just other simple things that we did as well, like taking kids on local mission trips around here as well. We went over to the Carmi Children's Home, I remember, a couple of different times, and did some work there at the facilities, landscaping and things like that to help out there. We also took a mission trip up to Chicago a couple of different times that didn't involve Uptown Baptist Church, but we just spent several days going around Chicago getting involved in different mission projects. Eventually, we developed a connection with someone in Guatemala, and became a friend of the church and became a connection point for us. And we took several trips down to Guatemala that involved and took high school kids with us on those trips as well. So a few kids through the years got a chance to experience an international mission trip to another country that obviously were very, very powerful as well. So I just feel like that's an attitude of ministry that permeates our church, but also permeated our youth ministry as well.